The air was thick with a velvet kind of silence, heavier than mere quiet, textured and scented with the breath of old stone, candle wax, and the dust of saffron blown from a nobleman's table. Somewhere, just out of view, water trickled slowly down the inside of a palace wall, its sound soft, almost meditative, like a whisper that had traveled too far to still be understood. You are in Persia, old Persia. A world of jewels and blades, of poetry read in secret, and punishments carried out in full view. The torches along the outer court of the palace burned low, throwing gold across the tiled walls and shadowing the columns in long, flickering veils. Inside, the scent of cardamom clung to silk. The servants moved as if underwater, their feet bare, their faces unreadable. This was a court that did not welcome laughter, except when it was meant to hurt. Before we begin tonight's descent into one of the darker, stranger corridors of human power, take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. Maybe light a candle, if you're somewhere safe and quiet. And if this kind of immersive history draws you in, soft-spoken stories soaked in the richness of forgotten times, consider liking the video, subscribing, and letting the story continue to flow your way, week by week. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. It begins not with a queen, but with a child. Her name was Mah-Parwar, Moon's nurture, though she would not always be called that. Born in the late 16th century to a minor noble family near the silk-humid town of Qazvin, she was a girl not meant to rule. But then again, many of history's quiet terrors wore bracelets and embroidered shoes in their early days. Her earliest memory was the sound of her mother crying softly behind a lattice wall, crying because the neighbor's daughter had been married off to a tax collector with soft hands, while Mah-Parwar was promised to a man who smelled of copper and sweat. Her mother thought her sleeping. But even then, the girl had learned to listen silently. Qazvin was not yet a city drowned in splendor, but it was building itself toward it. Once capital, now second throne of the Safavid Empire, it bustled with merchant caravans and Turkish court architects, newly imported from Constantinople with ideas of domes and scale. And Mah-Parwar, bright-eyed and disturbingly still for a child, wandered its small, widening streets absorbing the music of traders' curses and perfume sellers' flattery. But destiny, in this old empire, was more about being seen by the right man than being seen doing the right thing. And so it was that, at the age of 13, Mah-Parwar caught the glance of a court eunuch while handing out rosewater at a cousin's wedding. She had large, unblinking eyes and a posture too proud for her station. Within a month, she was removed from her home, not violently, but with the eerie smoothness of court affairs. Her family was told this was an honor. She was brought into the royal harem of Shah Abbas I, the peacock of Persia. A man so lionized in Persian history, his flaws have often been retold as virtues. Tall, with a cruel sense of humor and an obsessive cleanliness, Abbas ruled with an elegance that masked his paranoia like jasmine masks decay. The harem was a universe of its own, more stable than the court and often more powerful. Behind the privacy of high whitewashed walls lived over 300 women, some wives, some concubines, some political hostages turned luxuries. Mah-Parwar was not the most beautiful. But she was clever, and, perhaps more importantly, she was patient. Where others bickered over fabrics or jewels, she watched. She learned the names of guards' children. She never forgot a eunuch's birthday. By 16, she was reading Persian poetry and quoting Sa'di with a sharpness that drew Abbas's attention. Not his affection, not yet, but his curiosity. She had begun to master the art of speaking volumes without ever contradicting her superior. A game of facial expressions, careful silences, and the occasional well-placed sigh. When the Shah took her as a consort, it was not love. But Mah-Parwar understood the calculus of power. And Abbas, for all his fire, admired precision. She pleased him by never asking for anything directly. And in return, he gave her a small estate, 2 silken horses, and an education no woman outside the harem could dream of. But Abbas was not a man of stability. He was haunted by the future, and by the sons who would inherit it. One by one, he had them blinded, ritually, publicly, with boiled vinegar and surgical knives. He trusted no heir. Power, he believed, corrupted long before it passed hands. And so, Mah-Parwar did what the wise do in an empire that eats its own children. She played a longer game. She bore no children herself but positioned herself as indispensable to those who did. She midwifed, she consoled, she plotted quiet reconciliations. She became the whisper behind the veils. Years passed. Abbas died. And into the throne room walked a new Shah, one far less lion-like. Shah Safi, Abbas's grandson, was a weaker man by every metric except cruelty. Raised in paranoia, the boy had been fed on fear and flattery. Now a man of 20, he inherited the greatest Persian empire in 2 centuries, and had no idea how to rule it. Mah-Parwar, now nearly 40, watched him from behind the gold-embroidered veil of a senior court woman. She watched the way he drank, the way his hand trembled at the sight of Persian steel, the way he dismissed old generals with a pout. She smiled. Quietly. And then, an opportunity. The new Shah, childless and insecure, married. The bride, a Georgian noblewoman of famed beauty and legendary temper. She brought with her fire and dance, and for a few months the court buzzed with laughter again. But not for long. The Georgian bride, whose name is mostly lost to time, except for whispered titles like the Lioness of Kartli, soon tired of Safi's games. She mocked his advisers. She dismissed his concubines as soft pomegranates. And worst of all, she struck him across the face. In court. Safi ordered her confined, then executed, then changed his mind. Enter Mah-Parwar. By now, she was called Khanum Pasha, a title loosely meaning Lady Empress, given by no law, but upheld by fear. She approached Safi in silence, handed him a plate of figs, and said nothing. That evening, the Georgian wife was found in her chambers, veins opened with glass, lips blue, death ruled as suicide. The court murmured. Mah-Parwar was not challenged. But this was only the overture. Because it was not yet her story. Her story, her real story, begins with the next Shah Abbas II. A boy of 9, when crowned, and under her guardianship. She was now in her 50s, dressed in black, her face a ghost of its former beauty but still commanding. She became, in practice if not in name, the regent. And now we arrive at the man she would one day order flayed alive, Sara Taki. But before the knives, before the honeyed ropes and peeled flesh, there was courtship. Political courtship. Sara Taki was not of noble birth. He was the son of a brickmaker, born in Kashan. He rose not through war or marriage, but calculation. A man who smelled always of mint, who never drank, who wrote poetry in the margins of court records. He was appointed vizier by Abbas II under Mah-Parwar's silent endorsement. At first, they worked in tandem. He was effective. Corruption dropped. Roads were built. Coinage was stabilized. But then something shifted. Sara Taki began acting independently. He dismissed generals without approval. He raised taxes. He whispered to the Shah directly. He invited artists to court whom Mah-Parwar had personally exiled. And worst of all, he referred to himself, more than once, as pillar of the empire, a phrase once used by others for her. He began to call her grandmother, with a smirk. And in Persia, insults were never shouted. They were whispered with honey. Mah-Parwar waited. She gathered rumors like rose petals. She fed his enemies just enough hope. She praised him publicly, loudly, too loudly. He became complacent. And then, one evening in the summer of 1645, as the pomegranate trees began to bloom red outside the palace, a command was given. In the morning, Sara Taki was gone. The court asked, exile? No. His body was found in the bathhouse, laid out like a saint, but flayed from collar to knee. The skin, peeled in sheets, had been hung like drying linens. It was said she watched. It was said she requested he remain alive as long as possible. It was said she smelled jasmine the entire time. And so ended the man who called her grandmother. But not the story. Because cruelty, once uncaged, does not go back to sleep. and Mah-Parwar was just getting started. The streets of Isfahan woke up slower than the palace. While the sun crawled above the tiled domes and minarets, bending light around blue-glazed bricks and the soft gold of morning prayers, the butcher's boy down in Charbagh Street was already stacking lamb kidneys. He whistled a rude song. A woman in orange hurried by, her scarf trailing in flower-dusted air. Somewhere, a cracked lute sang badly of love. It was a city full of noise and scent and choked heat, but above it all, unreachable, was the woman in black who had just peeled a man like fruit. No official announcement had been made. The palace never explained its messes. But everyone knew. The whispers trickled outward, curling under lattice windows and through incense halls. He called her grandmother, someone said. He called himself the pillar, added another. He didn't bow fast enough. Or maybe he just forgot she was watching. No one mentioned the bathhouse. No one needed to. The smell of boiled skin, those who had caught even a whiff, had already done the remembering. But Mah-Parwar, or Khanum Padshah, as the court still called her, was not basking. She was planning. See, a flaying wasn't about punishment. It was about recentering gravity. Sarataki had begun to believe he was weighty. She reminded the empire that she was the sun, and others merely revolved. Abbas too, now 12, did not cry for sorrow. He asked only once, "Was he in pain?" Mah-Parwar blinked slowly. "He was in power," she replied. The boy said nothing more. Power in 17th century Persia was a careful orchestra of betrayal, poetry, and peacocks. The Safavid court had become something between a garden and a trap. Rose-scented, murderous, beautiful. It had grown decadent under the shadow of its own achievements. The Grand Bazaar's pulse was silk, jade, and Ottoman tobacco. Diplomats strolled in turbans worth a laborer's yearly wage. But Mah-Parwar saw the rot curling beneath the marble. So she did what rulers do best when they sense decay, she married it. Not herself, of course. Her days of personal wedding sheets were long over. But she arranged a union so brilliantly devious it was almost admirable. She found a noble family too minor to matter, too proud to resist, and offered them what every second-rate aristocrat wanted, royal blood. She promised the marriage of one of their sons to a niece of the Shah, a girl whose bloodline, while technically imperial, was diluted enough to be controllable. The wedding would be opulent, the favors generous. But there was a catch. The boy, poor, fluttery-eyed, 17-year-old Hossein, would be groomed. No, not romantically. Politically. He would become the next Grand Vizier. And she would be the hand in his robe. Hossein was not ambitious. He was, as his mother had once described him, soft as overcooked lentils and just as pale. But he was obedient. And he did not question Mah-Parwar's teachings, never speak first, never wear more jewels than the Shah, and never forget the first man to call her grandmother. In court, Hossein was received politely. The other ministers laughed at him behind lacquered fans. They called him the Shadow's puppet and grandmother's doll. But they underestimated how dangerous puppets could be, especially when the puppeteer had no strings attached to morality. By year 2 of his tenure, 4 rival ministers had died of sudden illness. One slipped on honey. Another drowned in 2 inches of water in a decorative fountain. The message was always subtle but clear. Mah-Parwar had not only rerouted power but fertilized it with the bones of the forgetful. Meanwhile, Abbas too, now 16, began to blossom. He drank. He hunted. He took lovers like fruit from a dish. And Mah-Parwar, who had once wiped pomegranate juice from his chin, now observed him with the eyes of a falcon too old to chase, but not too old to mark prey. She was not jealous. She was calculating. A queen regent does not feel betrayal from a boy king she raised like a son. She feels only inconvenience. And when inconvenience grows too large, it must be removed. But Mah-Parwar also knew the rules. She could not remove the Shah. She could only replace the space around him. So she created a new court within the court. A parallel hive. In one wing of the palace, she gathered her scholars, eunuchs, women, and loyal midwives. They called it Dargah Coffee, the hidden court. Its servants reported directly to her. Its documents never reached Abbas's hands. She maintained peace by filtering information, like honey through muslin. For example, when the Shah's favorite concubine fell ill with a fever, it was Mah-Parwar's doctors who treated her. When she died, it was Mah-Parwar's scribe who drafted the official story. Choked on melon. The Shah mourned. But not too deeply. Because Mah-Parwar ensured he was distracted, with gifts, games, dancers, and whispers. Drink, Your Majesty. Ride, Your Majesty. Touch, taste, forget, Your Majesty. And he did. Until one day, he noticed something. His treasury was light. His personal guards were fewer. His vizier, increasingly unavailable. And Mah-Parwar? Always just in the other room. One night, after too much wine, Abbas burst into her private chamber. He was 20 now, full of rage and perfumes. "You are not Empress!" he shouted. Mah-Parwar looked up from her chessboard, where she had been playing herself. "No," she said softly. "I am not. You act like it. You move like it. Everyone bows to you." She said nothing. "I am Shah. I am son of lions." She smiled. Not mockingly. Not kindly. Like a mother watching a child discover thunder. "Yes," she said, "and lions are often caged for their beauty." That was when he slapped her. The room froze. The guards outside didn't move. Mah-Parwar, cheeks burning, did not flinch. She reached up, slowly, and adjusted her headscarf. Then she stood. She looked at him, not as a subject. Not as a surrogate mother. But as a ghost looking through a body. "You are not your grandfather," she whispered. And then she walked past him. That was the last time the Shah saw her alive. She did not die immediately, of course. But from that night on, Mah-Parwar began arranging her legacy. She was nearing 60. Her hair, once raven dark, was now veiled not for modesty, but to conceal the winter creeping in. Her hands trembled in the mornings. Her eyes, once hawk-sharp, now stung in low light. So she wrote. She called in scribes and told them to remember. She dictated edicts she never sent. Drafted apologies no one would receive. She began to erase her enemies not with knives, but ink. She forged letters between court rivals. Stirred jealousy. Fed paranoia. And slowly Abbas, young, flailing Abbas, became isolated. Hossein, her puppet, resigned mysteriously and retired to a villa provided by her estate. The generals grew distant. The merchants complained. One by one, the pieces were pulled from under him. And then Mah-Parwar vanished. No official illness. No ceremony. One evening, her chamber was empty. Her veil lay on her bed. A single rose was found floating in her private fountain. Some said she had fled. Some said the Shah had had her killed. But no one saw a body. And whispers rose again, soft and insidious as perfume. "She's not dead. She's watching. She's waiting." They called her the woman in the walls. They said if you spoke her name after dark, your tongue would dry and split. They said she still walked the palace at night, inspecting silence. And perhaps she did. Because while Abbas ruled another decade, he was never the same. He stopped drinking. He stopped laughing. He surrounded himself with guards who never blinked. And in his final years, he was heard muttering, not prayers, not regrets, but something stranger. He whispered again and again. "She said I'm not my grandfather." But you must understand, Mah-Parwar was not cruel by accident. She lived in a world where mercy was seen as weakness. Where the court women who smiled too brightly were found smothered in their sleep. Where a woman who wanted to survive had to become a myth, or a corpse. She chose myth. And in doing so, she gave Persia a strange kind of stability. For decades after her disappearance, no woman dared claim her level of power. No vizier dared outshine the Shah. The empire, while not flourishing, did not fracture. And all because one woman taught a nation to fear silence more than swords. Now let's continue to the years after her disappearance, when those she had elevated, protected, and terrified began shaping Persia in her absence. And when the memory of flayed skin returned, haunting not the guilty, but the bold. It began with whispers in the quiet corners of the empire, soft, like a secret passed between trembling hands. In the northern cities of Persia, where the cold wind bit through the cotton robes of merchants, and the scent of pine mixed with smoke from wood fires, a new figure emerged. A woman wrapped in layers of dark silk, her face hidden behind a veil so tight that no one could remember the shape of her eyes or the curve of her smile. She moved through bazaars and caravansaries without drawing attention, paying in full, never bargaining, and asking the barest questions. But wherever she went, officials quietly disappeared. Not with the spectacle of court assassinations or the brutality of palace intrigues, but as if swallowed by the earth itself, reassigned to distant provinces, declared ill, simply erased from memory. She was called Kanamise, the Lady of Shadow. Stories about her swirled in the markets and caravans. Some said she was the reincarnation of Mah-Parwar herself, risen from the ashes of centuries to reclaim the power she had forged with blood and cunning. Others whispered that she was the living spirit of the Georgian queen whose death had once set the Shah's wrath in motion. Some told of curses and blood moons, of a spectral woman who walked silently on the palace roofs at midnight. But these were just stories, fabricated, stretched, and embroidered by fear and fascination. The truth was more subtle, and infinitely more dangerous. She was Mah-Parwar's final contingency. Born of the shadows that had nurtured the woman who ruled Persia not with a sword, but with a silence so sharp it cut deeper than steel, Noura had been raised in secret. Hidden away in an obscure northern estate, protected by the last loyalists of the Silent Roses, the secret sisterhood who had vowed to safeguard Mah-Parwar's legacy even beyond death. They were women trained in patience and perception, and the art of power folded inside a whisper. They taught her to listen to the subtlest shifts in tone, to read documents like prophecies, to move with the grace of a shadow passing over water. Noura grew up not as a princess, but as a scholar and a spy. While other children learned to ride horses and wield daggers, she learned to wield words and numbers. She memorized tax codes, traced the genealogy of noble families, and learned the dialects of every province in the empire. Her teachers told her that the empire was a living organism, fragile but resilient, and that its heart beat in the balance between tradition and change. As Persia faltered under Abbas II's weak rule, Noura saw the fractures deepen. Corruption gnawed at the borders. Factions formed in the shadows. The very bureaucracy that once held the empire together became a labyrinth of lies and rivalries. The empire was exhausted, worn thin by a century of whispered wars and public betrayals. And into this exhaustion stepped Noura, not with a sword, but with a ledger. She began her work quietly, systematically dismantling the old powers. She did not seize titles or command armies. Instead, she erased them. She pruned the branches of the imperial bureaucracy like a careful gardener, removing rotten limbs without uprooting the tree. Offices that existed only to glorify empty nobles were quietly dissolved. Positions filled with sycophants were eliminated under the guise of efficiency. Powerful governors were reassigned to barren lands or given diplomatic posts in distant provinces, places no one visited or cared about. All this was done with the silent approval of the empire's weary core. Where once a man might have wielded a dagger, Noura wielded the power of paperwork, stamped seals, forged edicts, and invisible hands guiding the pens of clerks. To the outside world, it seemed like mere administrative reform, but inside the palace, it was a revolution. Her most powerful weapon was invisibility. Noura moved like the wind through court chambers and caravansaries, a ghostly force shaping events from behind curtains and beneath veils. She spoke rarely and always softly, but when she did, her words were like poisoned arrows cloaked in silk. To her enemies, she was unknowable. To her allies, she was indispensable. She cultivated a network of spies and scribes, men and women who owed her loyalty not through fear, but through belief. They were scholars, merchants, eunuchs, and concubines, those whom the old empire had ignored, but who now carried its future in their hands. Most remarkable of all, Nura did not crave power for herself. She sought something far rarer in a world hungry for crowns: transformation. She wanted to rewrite the empire's story, line by line, decree by decree. Her ambition was not to sit on the throne, but to reshape the world that throne ruled over, erasing the brutal legacies of flayed men and whispered assassinations, replacing them with order built on quiet strength and patient governance. The empire, tired and battered, accepted her gift. They no longer wanted a lioness ruling with claws and fire. They wanted silence. They wanted peace. And Nura, above all, delivered it. Her final act of rewriting was as symbolic as it was practical. She ordered that every reference to Mah-Parwar, the woman who had once wielded power like a storm, be locked away in a secret archive beneath the palace. The vault was hidden behind false walls, its heavy doors sealed with forgotten keys, and guarded by silence itself. She commissioned the palace's stone carvers to erase Mah-Parwar's likeness from public fountains and monuments, and to drop the carved fragments into the river flowing through Isfahan. The woman who had been called the Pillar and the Grandmother was removed from the empire's visible memory, not in hatred, but in mercy. Because Nura understood that legacies fed by fear and cruelty were poisons disguised as gifts. And that to heal Persia, she had to let go of its ghosts. With the empire's legacy thus rewritten, Nura stepped away from the spotlight. She withdrew to the northern mountains, where pine trees whispered secrets to the wind and the cold air cleansed what the palace had stained. For the first time in a century, Persia had no woman pulling strings from behind the veil. No shadow queen guiding the empire's fate. Only peace. Only silence. Yet even now, centuries later, when the sun leans low over Isfahan's cracked tiles and the scent of jasmine drifts on the warm breeze, some say that in the hush of evening, the Lady of Shadow still walks the palace halls, not as a threat, but as a guardian. Her footsteps are soft, her presence nearly invisible. A quiet reminder that sometimes, the most powerful rulers are those who choose to fade away. Her name was Nura, and she preferred to arrive where others departed. She did not enter cities with procession or heraldry. She entered like fog on an empty street, soft, invisible until it had soaked into your skin. She kept her voice low, her steps quiet, and her words were chosen with the precision of a surgeon reaching for a single thread inside a mass of living veins. Nura had been raised by 3 women who spoke only in riddles, who bathed by moonlight, and who told her bedtime stories about Mah-Parwar, not as a woman, but as a weather system. She was thunder that walked, one of them had whispered once. She knew how to wait longer than fear. And so Nura learned waiting. She waited through her girlhood in a dried-out estate in the north, pretending to be a merchant's daughter while memorizing tax codes and courtly dialects. She waited through adolescence, watching Persia swell and loosen like a belly before sickness. She saw the empire shift under weightless rulers and corrupt governors, under plagues and thin coinage and the slow choking of forgotten reforms. Then, she stepped forward. But unlike Mah-Parwar, who played the game by its own poison rules, Nura made a new board. She began not by taking power, but by erasing it. Quietly, deliberately, she orchestrated the removal of titles, the dissolution of ancient offices, the retirement of positions that had long existed only to pad reputations. She used bureaucracy as her blade, nullifying privileges with a smile and a stamped seal. Those who stood in her way didn't die. They simply relocated, reassigned, found themselves head of imaginary offices or traveling ambassadors to cities that did not exist. She rewrote the story, line by line. And what surprised her most? No one fought her. The empire was tired. Tired of grand viziers and flames, of ceremonies and half-dead kings. Tired of the pretense of order in a world brimming with rot. They did not want a lioness. They wanted quiet. And that, above all, was what Nura delivered. Her final act, her quietest, was the burial of Mah-Parwar's name. She ordered every written reference to be sealed away in an archive vault beneath the palace, a vault no one remembered how to open. She had the stone carver who once engraved her name commissioned to chisel her likeness from a public fountain. The stone was then dropped into the river. And still, she was not erasing out of hate. She did it out of mercy. Because legacy, when fed by fear, becomes poison. And Nura, unlike her predecessors, believed the empire deserved sleep. So she let it. She stepped back. Disappeared into a corner of the northern mountains. And for the first time in nearly a century, Persia had no woman behind the curtain. It had peace. It had silence. Now, the palace of Isfahan stands still in the late afternoon light. The tiles are cracked. The fountains long dry. No perfume clings to the air. But sometimes, just sometimes, when the sun dips low and the shadows lean long across the mosaic floors, it's said you can hear soft footsteps behind the veil of silence. Not loud. Not menacing. Just present. And if you sit long enough near the old bathhouse walls, with a little wind, you might hear laughter. Soft. Old. Knowing. So now, listener, let your breath slow. Let your shoulders ease and fall. The courtly echoes of silk shoes and whispered vengeance have faded for the night. We have wandered through marbled halls and shadowed gardens, followed flayed men and ghostly women, tasted power steeped in jasmine and dust. But that time has passed. Now the tiles are warm with the sun's memory, and the corridors hum only with wind. The empire sleeps. The ghosts sleep. You can too. And when you rise, carry this, that even in the cruelest palaces, kindness sometimes survives, not in the rulers, but in those who choose to walk away. The story is done now. Rest easy.